everybody, it's Drybear. I just spent the last couple days kind of deep diving into the patch notes, and it has been an evolving process because not only are the patch notes for 0.3 Path of Exile 2 insanely long, to the point where there are a lot of nuggets built into one-liners in the patch notes that will absolutely shock you that you didn't even realize were in there. But additionally, they've been adding new stuff to the patch notes almost every day with new lines coming in as well. But now that we're 2 days out, we're at the end of, 2 days, maybe like a day and a half out from the release of the patch, I think it's good to kind of compile the patch notes into a little bit more digestible format. So what I'm going to do is a bit of a series going over the changes in 0.3 based on category, just because it's a little bit easier, at least in my mind, to understand. So today we're going to look at the general changes, like the game-wide changes that don't fall in a specific category. We're not going to talk about the league mechanics. We're not going to talk about individual classes. We're going to talk about like the system game level changes that are impacting the entire game overall, and then we'll split out the other changes by class and by category into separate videos, and hopefully by the end of the series it helps you really understand what really has changed with 0.3, because I guarantee you it's way more than you realize just by looking at small line items on the patch notes by themselves. Starting with some general global changes, the first one is now a nice gain for a lot of people. Uncut gems can now be traded on the currency exchange, which, remember, there's going to be a new NPC that handles both the new merchant tab as well as currency exchange. So that is being lost from Alva here, but you'll be able to go to the currency exchange, and normally you can really only do currency items, but with the new patch, they're making it so you can also get uncut gems from this. Keep in mind that the drop rate of uncut gems is being reduced across the board, so you're not going to be getting quite as many of them, and this is a good thing because we're kind of overloaded with the lower tier gems, so they're going to make it so it's a little bit easier to get. I mean, there's a reason why in PoE 2 I have 2 gem tabs, is because you get so many gems, it's ridiculous. It's actually insane how many gems you get, so it's going to be a lot easier for that, but having it so that you can get uncut gems, not necessarily from trading, but just going to the currency exchange, is going to be a nice global change. Another global change is pretty much across the board, across all equipable items and skills, the attribute requirements have been nerfed. It's about 20 to 25% for, most items. This is going to include equipment, weapons, rings, amulets, helmets, gloves, belts, everything that you can equip to your body. The stat requirements on them will be coming down between 20 to 25% with the patch, and this also includes skill gems as well. Pretty much everything that has a stat requirement will be 20 to 25% less in the patch, which means it's going to be much easier for you to be able to get the requirements to equip them. This is also helpful for classes that are dual stat, right? So if you go to the skill trees here, you have your dex, you have your main stats, right? If you understand the layout of the skill tree, this is, north is intelligence, southeast is dexterity, and southwest is strength, and then in between is the hybrid stats, so strength and intelligence, intelligence and dexterity and strength. So by reducing the stat requirements on the gear as well as on the skills, it means that everyone's going to benefit, because intelligence is going to be easier for you to get dexterity options and strength options. If you're playing dexterity strength, it can be easier for you to straddle those two stats to get the requirements you need. It's going to be easier across the board. Now, I'll be doing a video that's separate for like crafting changes and item changes, but I want to mention this briefly in this video here. There are going to be new orb tiers, omen tiers, or omen adjustments, as well as essence tiers and things like that will allow you to give more control over the crafting that you have. Again, just so you're aware, there's going to be, as I see on screen, there's a normal, greater, and perfect version of transmutation, augmentation, chaos, regal, and exalted that will all have different effects. If you're wondering what happens when the tiers go up, they generally just guarantee a higher quality outcome. So the level of the modifiers that come out of things like this can be higher with a higher quality orb, and it will also help with trading and general pricing as well, because currently, we're anywhere from 900 to 3,000 exalted orbs for one divine, but if we have normal, greater, and perfect exalted, that exchange rate gets a little bit easier because the coins we can use or the orbs we can use can get a little bit more refined as well. Once the new patch goes live as well, we're going to be able to gain access to a new aiming mode. So right now, if you go to options and you go to your actual input, right? So you can see this here. There's no aiming mode. There's a current aiming mode built into the game as it stands right now, which is ground targeting. However, they're adding a brand new mode, which I think will be very helpful for pretty much anyone if they decide to use it. They have a new aiming mode, cursor targeting. So with ground targeting, which is the way the game works right now, basically wherever your cursor is, console or PC, whether it's WASD or mouse and keyboard, like just true mouse aiming, wherever your targeter is, that's where it's going to put down ground targets, and it tries to send, skills and projectiles towards that location as well. However, they're going to be adding in .3 a brand new aiming mode called the cursor targeting. What cursor targeting does, instead of trying to aim at the ground location of your cursor, it will then instead, for projectile-based attacks, it will ignore targets that are where your cursor is. It'll try to go past your cursor with the projectile, so it'll like phase through them. Which means that if you're aiming right in front of you, you might be able to shoot projectiles past near targets if you're trying to aim more precisely. It is a different logic setup than the ground targeting mode that's currently in the game right now. But with .3, the default ground targeting becomes one of the options, but you could also switch to cursor targeting if you want to use that instead. They're also going to allow you to assign both a single weapon setup to both weapon slots, right? So if we put a weapon in here, there's going to be an option that allows you to assign the current setup to both of your weapon sets. So it kind of has this here, so you can actually have this set up, and which means that if you're trying to duplicate the same weapon set, or you just don't care that much, it can be useful to do that. Currently, there isn't any real way to do that right now, but in the future with .2 or .3, we'll be able to set that by targeting it and just holding down the button on console, or just clicking that option if you just want to spread it forward, so it's a little bit of a quality of life. Another thing that may have escaped your notice is the fact that with .3, they did some very heavy engine level reworks. Now, generally with engine level reworks, the goal is to improve the experience. Generally, if it's done well, it will improve the experience. But again, when you swap out systems or rewrite, engine level functionality, there's always going to be things that slip through the cracks or things that aren't properly stress tested, because you can't really stress test it on a small group internally. So with this patch, they reworked all of the logic for cached files. And they also they said they reworked and rewrote the entire graphics renderer. Their claim with this is that these changes will result in faster load times across the board, whether that's with load screens, loading into new areas, monsters loading in and out. It also should reduce the memory overhead and memory cost. So, performance across the board should be improved in general, with load times and FPS improving as well. They kind of put this as an undernote in the patch notes, but I think it is worth highlighting that you will be getting, hopefully, if things work as intended, you will be getting not only a performance increase, but just like a load on your system improvement on console and PC as well. So if you're someone that was having issues with performance in general in Path of Exile 2 before, hopefully that is improved. Again, a big disclaimer here, usually when you rewrite engine level code, you probably will be introducing new crash issues as well. So especially when you mess with the graphics renderer, there's probably going to be new issues with that where, new crashes and stuff like that. So kind of just hold your breath and see. If everything went well and they did everything right and their engineers did awesome, I think in general, GGG has very good engineering staff. So I have high confidence that this will be better, but just keep in mind that some very major overhauls went into the core system for the game itself, and you should be noticing that in .3. Next, let's talk about console. So a bunch of stuff is going in for console. And again, the goal of this video is to be general, high level, entire game encompassing, but I want to talk about the console changes here. So not only are we getting a marketplace on console, so there'll be a new marketplace where you can dive into the game and buy items from trade directly in the game client without opening a browser, bringing up your phone, a tablet, or a laptop. You can do it directly in the game, and that I think will be a much, at least an option, but in my opinion, an improvement for console players. But that's not all. They did some pretty nice changes that, again, got buried in the patch notes that you may not have been aware of, that are now going to be part of the console experience. First of all, the stash UI for console specifically has been updated. I personally play on PC, so I can't tell you if it, if the stash on console is bad or not. If you play on console, let me know what you think about this. But they said that the stash UI, it probably has to do with tabs over here. I can imagine this being kind of annoying on console to try and click through these. I'm not sure how it's set up, so let me know how you feel about this. But they say that the stash UI for console has been completely overhauled. They also added in 2 new functionalities for console, which I think will be a nice boon for people that play with controller. The first one is, when you pause the game. So if you didn't know, in Path of Exile 2, they have a hot pause function. If you bring up your escape menu and you're not in a party, or if everyone in a party brings up the escape menu, the game will actually pause. So right now the game is paused. You can see nothing's animating, nothing's moving. The game is completely paused right now. They're adding in .3 a new functionality that allows you to, while paused on console, you will have your reticle that you can move around with analog. You can actually go down to your buffs and click off buffs. And I can see this being a big problem for people that play on console. If you want to, end a buff or aura early by clicking it off, I just do that with my mouse, but I can see on console that being really difficult and kind of cumbersome to do. So they're adding an option now where if you're on console and you hit the escape menu, you can now use your controller to go over to your buffs and click them off if you want them to end without having to try and, move while you're doing it or mess with combat. So that's a cool addition for console. And the third addition for console, which is a great one too, they're going to add a brand new key binding exclusive to your controller that will allow you to, when you press and hold this key bind, zoom in. So you can actually, especially, you're on a TV screen 10 feet away from your couch and you're trying to see what's going on. There's now a keybind for console in .3 coming in 2 days now that will allow you to zoom in on console, which hopefully allows you to see better and maybe even allows you to zoom in on pop-ups and tooltips and stuff like that as well, assuming it's a global keybind. Next is a big one you've probably heard about, but it is a game-wide change, and that is the addition of the ability to sprint. So the way this works is after .3 goes live, when you hold the dodge roll button, your character will bust out into a sprint. You will move pretty much faster than any other monster in the game, incredibly fast. However, it has a massive downside because it's meant to be an out-of-combat action. If you take damage while sprinting, you will get staggered and fall to the ground and probably die considering how many enemies are around you, that sort of thing. So you will be able to hold the dodge roll button and sprint, and then if you take any action, use an ability, dodge roll out of the sprint, it will cancel the sprint and you won't be knocked over, but it means that you can use it to backtrack on large maps, you can use it to get around if you need to, and if you're smart, you can use it to get around enemies, being careful not to take damage in that process. I still have questions on how this functionality works. Like, say, for example, I have a damage over time effect on my character. Does that mean that when the dot ticks, I'm going to fall over in the sprint? Or is there a damage threshold for low levels of damage? Also, how does this work with like ground deployables? So say a river hag spawns a little puddle at my feet, or there's a fire puddle on the ground, or some kind of poison area. If I sprint over the passive ground effects, does that count as damage and I fall over? It says when you get hit, you fall over, but I think there's going to be some edge cases that are worth testing. And also, they just added this note today to the patch notes. They are adding an option to the options menu that allows you to toggle a keep sprinting. What this means is by default, the functionality will be press and hold the dodge roll button and you will break into a sprint and sprint for as long as you're holding it. However, they're going to add a option menu option in .3 with the launch of the new season that if you were to hit and hold the dodge roll button to start sprinting, if you let go of the dodge roll button, you will continue sprinting until you do an action that breaks you out of it. So for the people that prefer to just hit it and toggle it and then sprint around without holding it, that's going to be an option. So it's nice that they kind of added that preemptively before people started asking for it. Next, let's talk about global defense changes. There's actually a bunch of them in here that probably people haven't heard of. I think the overflow value change is, again, it's a line item that got buried deep in the patch notes that I haven't seen anyone talking about, but it's a pretty significant change. So that's something that's worth talking about. So pretty much how a lot of the global calculations for many of the defensive stats in the game have been reworked, tweaked, or changed in some way. The first one is to talk about armor in general. They are going to be adding not only base on strength armors in general, so anytime you get a strength armor, it can roll a modifier that converts a percentage of its armor into damage reduction for elemental attacks. If you haven't been playing since the launch of Path of Exile 2, the very first .1 release, there has been a big problem with armor characters having trouble dealing damage with, attacks that can't be absorbed in some way. And so a lot of times they would run unique items, they would convert physical damage or elemental damage into physical, or would convert all source damage types into a different element so they can focus on doing, one specific resistance or something. It kind of got really squirrely. And so they're adding in for armor a whole bunch of ways to convert that armor into elemental damage reduction, either through modifiers on the armor items themselves, nodes in the new passive tree. There's over 150 new passive nodes in the passive tree, so ways to deal with that as well. They're also adding in a brand new mechanic called Deflect, and this is going to be a way for evasion characters to get damage reduction. So Deflect is a brand new stat that is added to the game. That what they did this time around, different from the Path of Exile 1 implementation, is Deflect is essentially a new damage reduction modifier that is scaled based on how much evasion you have. I have done characters that are pure evasion in Path of Exile 2. It's one of the most stressful things you can do in this game. Like, you can get upwards of 70 to 90% evasion, which is great because you run around and you don't take any damage, However, in that 10% scenario where one attack gets through your evasion, especially if that one attack is a very large attack, when you're running pure evasion in Path of Exile 2, it was always awkward and uncomfortable because you'd be running around just fine, and then all of a sudden a large attack gets through your evasion, you get one shot and you're dead on the ground, and it just feels really awkward. And so there's been a lot of discussion on how we can get evasion characters and defenses to feel better, and this is the solution they're implemented. So there's now a new stat called Deflect that will roll on some of the dexterity-based items. It will also be available in the talent tree. And what this does is, based on your evasion, you have a chance to get damage reduction on attacks that will just reduce the damage you take when it makes it past evasion. So evasion and deflect now go hand in hand. When you scale your evasion, your deflect gets better, and they did that to make sure that everyone doesn't run deflect. They wanted it to be a solution specifically for evasion, but it also means that for the hybrid characters, dexterity int or dexterity strength characters, they can still run evasion with deflect, and it gives us more options for scaling with that as well, which is going to be pretty cool. Next, massive changes to the block mechanic. The global block value has been reduced of a maximum to 75% block down to a maximum of 50% block. We'll talk about this more when we get to the warrior changes specifically, but what you need to know is that the block values on pretty much every shield in the entire game have been massively reduced. The block value on some of the nodes in the tree have been changed. The maximum global block value has been reduced from 75% to 50%. Most people that run pure block builds were getting anywhere from 55 to like 70% block. I don't know if anyone getting to the maximum of 75%. Usually in the mid 60s was good enough. But now, if you were running 66% block before, now that's going to be 50% block without other modifiers. So in general, block just got worse. However, they made a global change where everything except for red unblockable attacks can be blocked now. Projectiles, range attacks, spell hits, things like that. So you can actually block pretty much everything in the game unless it's specifically marked as unblockable. I think in general, this is going to be it's a lot of buffs and nerfs all at once. I think some people are theorizing that this is going to be weaker for block-based characters. There are new modifiers and ways to increase your maximum block, and there are ways to deal with that as well. However, the hope is that with the armor gaining elemental damage reduction and the fact that all blocks, all hits can be blocked unless they're red unblockables, hopefully that means that overall it's a better experience. However, it does mean that, again, for those very heavy damage, single instances of damage, it could just be that defense for block-based characters just got worse, though it got more consistent across the board. We'll have to see where that lands. Next, another global change is they nerfed the maximum value of any overflow in the game. So this means overflowing energy shield, overflowing mana, or overflowing life. There are mechanics in Path of Exile 2 where, if you have maximum life and you gain life, either through leech or various methods, there are ways for you to overflow. So say you have 1,000 maximum life, you could potentially get to 1,500 or 2,000 maximum life by overflowing. They nerfed the overflow maximums across the board, across the entire game, meaning that life, energy shield, and mana can now only overflow to 150% of normal value instead of 200%. So I guess what they're trying to, their goal, I think, with this patch is try to get people to rely on recharge and recovery more than trying to just get as beefy as possible in a single hit. So with the overflow values coming down, it's a smaller note that probably doesn't get covered much, but it's one worth noting when we're talking about overall game-wide defense. Guard mechanic in this game got a pretty nice quality of life update. It's not a massive change, but it's one worth noting. Weaker versions of guard will no longer overwrite the existing version. This is a huge problem for like snapshotting, especially for damage over time debuffs on targets and things like that, but it's something that was happening with the guard mechanic as well. So now, if you have a higher or better version of guard on your character, and it tries to apply a weaker version of guard, it will fail. It'll actually just extend the duration of it instead. So when you reapply guard, if it fails to overwrite, it'll just extend the duration, but keep the higher value, which just makes guard better across the board. Next is an awkward change, in my opinion, for parry. I feel like there's going to be people on one side or the other, but let me explain. Parry is a mechanic that allows you to, with like Huntress bucklers and things like that, you can bring your shield up, and if you bring it up within a time, just like any action game, if you bring it up fast enough within the right time window, you will end up parrying the attack. It'll apply a parried debuff to the target, and then you can use that to actually consume the debuff or do various things. However, they're doing a logic level change to all parries in the game, which you will notice right away if you were playing parry in previous versions of the game, since Huntress was added. What they're doing is they're making it so parry and raise shield, so not just parry, but also raise shield for shields, it will now check direction based on the owner of that attack, not the attack itself. So what that means is, normally, if you're facing an enemy and they attack at you, if you raise shield, you'll be able to parry or block. Previously, in the current version of the game, if there's like, say, a ground deployable that's behind you, so if we jump in game, we can show this real quick. So say that you're out in the area here. Say the enemy is standing in front of you where your cursor is, and they throw a ground effect or an explosion behind you. In the current version of the game, when you're blocking or parrying, you would need to block and parry in the direction of the deployable to get the block, which makes sense to me, right? That's where the damage is coming from. That's where you're getting hit from. So if the enemy is here and you see the explosion going off behind you, you would need to turn your character around and parry and block that, then turn it back to the enemy. They are doing a global logic change with .3 that makes it so it is now always in the direction of the owner of that attack. So in this example, where there's an enemy on my left that's spawning a ground explosion behind me, I would just need to keep blocking or parrying in the direction of the enemy. So I think that's a logic level change. It probably makes more sense to people from like a high level perspective, like, oh yeah, obviously. Personally, I always, in action games, turns toward the direction of what's hitting me, but it's, it probably makes more sense to do it that way. Let me know if this makes sense to you and what you think about that. I think either way, there's going to be people that prefer one or the other, but this is the choice they're making. And lastly, they're making some global changes to accuracy. Melee characters will have near perfect accuracy. Melee minions that are spawned have basically near perfect accuracy and or perfect accuracy and can't miss at all. And they're also changing the accuracy scaling. So characters gain +6 accuracy per level, up from 3. So every time you level up, you will get double the amount of accuracy that you were getting passively before. And they also made it so dexterity grants +1 additional accuracy for every point of dexterity that you have. So it used to give every point of dexterity grants +5 accuracy. Now dexterity grants +6 for every point of dexterity. So if you're a dexterity character or a hybrid character that uses dexterity, your accuracy has increased, and all melee accuracy has increased a great amount. Next, let's talk about the global combat level changes. There's a lot of them in this patch, a serious overhaul to the pure combat system. The first one is going to be vulnerability. This is a way for you to apply a weakness or a down res on the target. And historically, there has been one for each of the 3 elements: cold exposure, fire exposure, and lightning exposure. Now, what they noticed, which is true about the way elements work in Path of Exile 2, is that people were always forced to doing one element. It's because there was so much opportunity cost built into doing a single element that it became very difficult to include other elements. So what they're doing with this patch is they're trying to homogenize the elemental system so that you're more encouraged to mix elements to greater effect with much less opportunity cost. So they're taking the vulnerability, any form of that vulnerability, whether it's a curse, a debuff, an effect of an item, wherever that exists across the entire game, all elemental exposures have been merged into a single exposure. So cold exposure, fire exposure, lightning exposure have all been merged into a global elemental exposure. One source, one stat, that is it. This extends even further to like the cast on effect. So cast on freeze, cast on ignite, cast on freeze, cast on ignite, cast on shock. All of those have been merged into a single cast on ailment. So again, not only are you getting more opportunity to apply vulnerability with a single source, but now the cast on triggers have been homogenized to just be cast on ailment. As long as you do any elemental ailment, the cast on ailment new gem will trigger just on any ailment. So again, a global modifier for elements in general. Additionally, they reworked or buffed essentially. They buffed all of the status ailments in the game: Ignite, Shock, and Chill. The short version of this is Chill's duration has been increased to 8 seconds. Shock's duration has been increased to 8 seconds, and we'll get into this with the other videos for class level changes, but there are some that are kind of like messing with the magnitude of Chill, the buildup of Freeze, the magnitude of Shock, all of those. Even like Electrocution got some nice buffs as well, and they're reworking how Ignite works from the ground up as well. So previously you had a chance to ignite and it would either fail or succeed. Now they're adding in a stat, or kind of reclaiming the name of a stat, called flammabilities, which is basically a pity system. Instead of a chance to ignite or not, now it's a pity system, which is your fire attacks that do fire damage will apply a certain amount of flammability to the target. As flammability gets higher and higher, the likelihood that that target gets ignited goes up and up to the point where it eventually will get guaranteed. So it's a pity system. So if you shoot at a fire attack that adds flammability and the target does not become ignited, their likelihood of becoming ignited starts going up and up and up with every source of fire damage until they're guaranteed to get flammable, and also allows them to scale the amount of flammability that gets applied per fire attack. If an attack they feel needs to ignite more, they'll increase its base flammability. If it needs to ignite less, they'll nerf it down, but it gives them more things that they can play around with on that front to make fire attacks better in general. The other thing for elemental combat changes in general is the addition of a new effect called Infusions. We had a little bit of this with Huntress in .2, but they're now making it a global thing. There will be, across the game, in various sources and various locations, the ability to spawn a elemental infusion. It's like a little orb that spawns on the ground. You can walk over it and pick it up. It'll give you a stack of that element infusion. There are fire infusions, cold infusions, and lightning infusions. Now, once you have an infusion on your character by spawning it through various means, you will then be able to consume that infusion to add that element to viable attacks or spells. There are a lot of sorceress spells now that, you know, for example, like Spark can now have a new element added to it. You can make Arc consume a lightning infusion to do bonus effects on that as well. We'll go over that on the sorceress specific video, but now you can have the ability to drop infusions and then use that to add elements to existing skills and attacks, which is pretty cool. And last note on combat, all the Spellcaster Weapons skills, so like, you know, all the Spellcaster skills typically come from right now, like the wands and staves that are for witches and sorceresses. They have an inherent skill that when you have it equipped, that skill gets added to your skill list. All of those inherent skills on Spellcaster Weapons, the damage of those abilities has been increased by about 12% across the board. So all inherent skills on all Spellcaster Weapons, including the new ones that are coming in. They're adding like 8 new Spellcaster Weapons with new Spellcaster skills into this patch. They've all been increased in damage. Next, let's talk about the monster level changes. Again, another section of the patch notes that I think hasn't really been talked about too much, and it does affect your overall experience. So we've talked a lot about the changes to characters, items, skills, and things like that, but there's also a bunch of changes to the monsters you're attacking that you will notice when you're playing. The first one is monster evasion rating scales less with level across the entire game. So not only are we getting better accuracy, melee characters and melee minions are getting very high accuracy the closer you are to the target, but also it's going to be about 30% less evasion for monsters at level 80, and it scales across the game. So at the start of the game, monsters will have less evasion rating, and that evasion rating will scale slower over time until it reaches level 80, where they have now 30% less evasion rating than before. So our chance to hit is going up. The chance for monsters to evade is going down globally. Additionally, the life of most Act 3 bosses is going down by about 15%. So like Blackjaw, most of the Act 3 bosses in general. I know some people felt like it was a big jump in difficulty from Act 2 to Act 3, and it really just depends on how much you know how to make your character stronger impromptu. Like just when you switch over to Act 3, you go to the vendors, you craft some things, or maybe if you're trade league, you trade, but you try to increase your power. They basically reduce the HP values of a lot of the bosses, if not most of the bosses in Act 3 to compensate. Rogue Exiles now get additional life scaling after level 65, and additionally, the Rogue Exile loot is now affected by rarity of items found. I didn't even realize it wasn't doing this before, but now in general, Rogue Exiles will have more life as they go higher in level, but they also will have better loot, and the loot they drop is now affected by the modifier rarity of items found. And they say globally they improved the monster AI, so the monster behavior across the board, they did a once-over on it and tried to make it better. So you'll probably will notice that pathing, decision-making, how they attack, where they move, things like that in general, hopefully is better than it was before. Next, let's talk about trials. I think this is a big thing for a lot of people. A lot of people have, big concerns about how the 2 trials work in the game right now. There's also a 3rd trial that's being worked on and will be added to the game as well. But the 2 main takeaways for the trial changes in general is if you've ever done the 4th trial of the Trial of Sekhmet, fighting off against Zarok, they made some changes to the hourglass mechanic to make it easier. There were definitely some builds that struggled really hard on Sekhmet 4 that made it really difficult to complete. So they made it so that now if you miss an hourglass in the transition for Zarok, it no longer instantly fails, but instead just hurts your honor, which I think is a nice change. The instant failure kind of felt kind of weird. They also made it so that if you miss hourglasses, it will now just force a second phase instead of failing instantly. So you'll take honor damage, and if you do it again, it'll force a second phase. But I think that makes it so it's a lot easier for the slower moving characters that can't get around and hit those hourglasses as easily to be a lot more reliable. Next is probably one of the biggest global changes to the game that you will notice right away. So if we jump into game here real quick, the support gems have been updated as well. So now, at least before the patch, right, the support gems that we have will end up doing, you can only have one version of every support gem on each skill, right? So if you were to put blind on a skill, you cannot use blind on any other skill, so you won't be able to use that again. And this led to a lot of awkward builds in general. There are some very widely useful support gems that a lot of builds use, things that are just globally useful. So things like martial tempo, where you can use this to increase your attack speed. Things like scattershot that allow you to fire additional projectiles. The problem with a lot of these is because you can only use one version of that gem across all of your skills, if you needed to apply things like poison, or you need to apply bleeding, or you need to increase chance to ignite, once you use it on one skill, it's locked, and that restriction is going away, which means that now, if you wanted to, you could use ignition on every single one of your skills. They did hint at potentially having more restrictions, like putting some of these in categories, which kind of makes sense. Having skills that add projectiles, maybe you don't want too many of these stacking together across multiple, so having restrictions on those. But in general, removing the restriction is a nice change and will open up a lot of builds. Like the impact of this change will not be felt probably for a couple weeks before people start figuring out how we can utilize this best. Next is the tiers of support gems. So if you notice here on the left side, we have alignment, and then we also have alignment 1, alignment 2, right? We have brutality 1, brutality 2, brutality 3. So there will be some support gems that don't have tiers on them, but a lot of them will have new tiers on them. And the way this works is it will start at a low value. Tier 2 will be an increase to the value of the effect you get from that support gem. And the highest tier of support gems may also provide a brand new functionality that the other tiers did not provide. So not only can you use duplicates of support gems across skills, but now you can also use varying degrees of the support gems depending on what you're trying to accomplish, which is going to be pretty cool and interesting depending on what we get from these new support gems. They're additionally adding 11 new support gems across the board. So there's new support gems being added. There's a couple of them that got removed as well. Blood in the Eyes, Discombobulate, Unsteady Tempo, Unbaiting, Unbending, Untouching, and Unyielding have all been removed to be added at a later date. Next up is a brand new kind of support gem that functions in the same way that normal support gems function as. However, it will adopt the old functionality that got removed, and that is you can only have one of each kind of lineage gem. I think you actually only have one lineage gem applied across your entire build. However, think of these as support gems that are unique level, right? So they're going to do something super special. You can see the one, depicted here, Wrath's Assault. You can do things like your crossbow can't reload, but you load when you dodge instead, and you load additional bolts when you load. So like crazy stuff, wild out there, things that can change skills and how they function by slotting in a support gem. These are going to be dropped in endgame activities and are going to be varying locations or rarities depending on where they come from, but these are unique level support gems. So support gems removing their restriction across the board of being able to use duplicates across different skills, getting tiers and more bonuses, and we're getting 40 new lineage support gems that will all do 40 different things that you can slot into your build as well. So those two changes, the support gem changes plus the lineage support gems, now gives us crazy new possibilities for the builds that we can make. Now I'm going to go over all the new skill gems based on the stat that they come from and what class they technically belong to in separate videos, but I did want to talk about the 4 new persistent buffs that we're getting into the game, which hopefully will fill some gaps that we have right now. The first one is a strength, so a red-based persistent buff called Iron Ward. It stores a percentage of the physical damage that is prevented by your armor or other sources of DR. Using this skill releases the stored damage as a nova of spikes. So kind of like the poison aura that we have now, but now can be used for physical damage based on armor characters that have strength. So it's a nice way to add a little bit of damage through a persistent buff. There's also a strength dex persistent buff called Mortar Cannon, and this one is actually a meta skill. It raises a cannon totem, which you can socket any grenade skill from the mercenary crossbow tree into the meta persistent buff, and then when this mortar cannon spawns, it'll fire whatever grenade skills it has inside of it with improved cooldown recovery rate. So it's basically a potato launcher that shoots grenades that you put into it down onto the ground to deal damage, which is pretty cool. There's also a pure dex persistent buff, Mirage Archer. You activate this when you dodge roll, you create a green after image of your character that sits there with a bow and fires range attacks for a short duration. You can only have one at a time, and then it eventually fades away. And when you dodge roll, you won't be able to create a new Mirage. It'll keep the previous one that you have. There's also a brand new intelligence persistent buff gem called Ravenous Swarm. While active and enemies are nearby, swarms of insects emerge from your body to pursue enemies. The swarms are untargetable minions that can't take damage, and they periodically attack and poison enemies with the swarm. But again, once we get to individual characters and classes, we'll get a little bit more into these skills and also how things like this may affect those individual classes. And actually, I missed one. There's also a new intelligence persistent buff called Siphon Elements. While active, you have a chance to create an infusion remnant when you apply a status ailment, so freeze, shock, or ignite. This is one of the ways to spawn those elemental infusions we talked about earlier. So while you have this up, anytime you apply a status ailment, an elemental status ailment, you will have a chance to create an infusion remnant on top of the other ways that you can spawn those as well. And lastly, let's roll through some of the skill changes across the board that affect either skills as a broad change, or they affect skills that, in my opinion, are more global and less specified to a specific element, a specific stat type, or a specific weapon or character class. All of those are going to be there as well. Now I'm just going to have my personal notes on screen so you can read through this if you want. There's quite a lot of these like global level changes. There are some of these that you really want to know about. It's like changes to like Herald of Thunder and Aura that gets used pretty much every martial class on the planet. Things like that are changing. Banners across the board are changing. So some pretty big things there as well. So base damage scaling on all player spell and secondary damage effects from skills has been tweaked to scale better into endgame. So pretty much every player spell and secondary damage effect in the game is getting better and scaling better in endgame. Again, we'll see this when we dive into individual classes where some of these go, but a lot of the values have been bumped up. So they're either a little bit better or the same at early game, and then maybe a little bit better or a little bit worse or the same at mid game. But in general, a lot of them have been increased to scale better into endgame, as long as they weren't already scaling like crazy. Any skills not listed in the patch notes have near identical base damage at low levels as before, but have around 5 to 20% more damage when you exceed the base level. So you go over 20 to 30, you're going to get more and more and more damage to make them scale better into endgame. Mana cost growth has been rebalanced in general. Like all of the mana costs in general have been brought down. Some of the mana cost requirements have been brought down. Also, there's been a lot of skills that have more mana cost efficiency being added, or in general, there's a lot of them that actually have higher mana recovery. So things like mana remnants or like mana siphon from the wand, all of those have been improved to have more mana recovery to make sure that more people have more access to mana in general. Banners across the board no longer gain valor, instead generate glory when you attack, and they cost glory to place, and they can gain glory while placed as well. On top of that, all the banners in the game have been changed so that when you leave the banner area, it doesn't turn off immediately. If you leave the aura, it stays there for its full duration. You can also now have a limit of 1 banner placed, but this can be increased through other means, just like we do with totems and things like that. Curses and exposures game-wide now check level difference before applying their effects. This is probably going to be not noticeable while doing the campaign, but as you start doing higher and higher super juiced maps, you may notice that your curses and exposures start failing against targets that have a large level difference between you and the effect and the level of the skill gem, yada yada. Another pretty big game-wide change, Blink, Convalescence, and Sacrifice must be active in both weapon sets. If they're not active in both weapon sets, they will no longer be usable. Curse effects are now also scaled by monster levels. So not only will they fail if there's a large level difference, but now they scale more, scale weaker and weaker depending on the target you're facing. So curse effects now have 15% less effect on magic or blue level enemies, 30% less on rares or yellow enemies, and 50% less effect on unique, so boss level enemies. Curses in general just have a scaling effect on them that you will notice while playing. Move speed penalty on moving skills recovers slightly faster, so if you incurred a penalty recently, it will start recovering faster. Specters in general are better. A lot of the high cost specters have come down in spirit cost. Some of the low cost specters have come up in spirit cost, and in general, specters and tame beasts from Huntress now deal 25% more damage at all levels, just getting stronger. Instant skills are now usable while riding the Roa mount from your auras. Mark skills, this is actually another one-line item that sounds very unassuming, but changing all mark skills from being spells being converted into skills is going to be a huge implication, specifically for ranger players, but more specifically Deadeye as well. There's some crazy changes that make Deadeye absolutely busted, and mark skills now becoming skills instead of spells is a pretty big implication from there as well. They also made it so game-wide reservation skills now have reservation efficiency with quality, and they also reworked like less reservation amount to be reworked into reservation efficiency, a new stat that you'll get with some of those skills now as well. Blink no longer counts as dodge rolling, and the minimum gem level has been reduced. Another big change, Combat Frenzy, one of the most popular ways to gain frenzy charges in the game right now, is having it so the quality provides a lower chance of gaining additional charge. So it used to be up to 20% with high quality. Now that is up to 10% with high quality. So Combat Frenzy with quality scalers is now providing less frenzy charges than it was before. We talked a little bit about things like, mana getting better across the board. This includes mana drain from attuned wands going up from granting 136 mana at the top end to 408 mana. Mana remnants, gives you 208 mana now. That will now go up to 281. So two very easy ways, especially for casters, to be able to get mana back. Also a reduction to scavenged plating. Armor per scavenged plating reduced from 5% to 4% at the top end, and the thorns provided is reduced per plating from 90 to 64 at the top end. We have a bunch of banner things in here like War Banner, Dread Banner, Defiance Banner. All those have had major buffs and applications to them that help them become stronger. Herald of Thunder now has a bolt radius decrease from 1.4 meters to 1 meter, so it will miss more than it did before. And that is probably a good place to stop. That's going over just the general level broad stroke changes to Path of Exile 2 at its core, with some features you hopefully didn't know about there were in the patch notes. And I wanted to kind of break this out. This one's probably going to be the longest of all of them. Now that we've got through this level, now we can dive more into specific like crafting changes, class level changes, things like that. But let me know what you think about the global changes going into this, and if this format was useful for you, let me know as well down below in the comments. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.